Okay, so we start with this first project, and it is a simple composition of a cup and a beach and a sky. So you have foreground, middle ground, background. This is the digital version, so some type of confetti, some type of line work, but you can still see the forms. It's starting to get a little more abstract. We move on to charcoal. So if you look at the clouds, they become these weird little circles. The foreground is getting a little bit more textural, but you can still understand the cup. Moving on to paint and collage. Again, the cup is very important, but the water becomes these flat waves. This is unconventional material number one, straws. You might use a straw to drink, but look at on-end straws. Those little circles become patterns. These are pills. Really kind of getting strategic with color coding the pills, become different objects, and the water just becomes this swath of blue. And finally, you have sprinkles and paint. The large body in the center is abstract. It becomes totally interesting from a shape point of view. And now you can look and see that each of the pieces start with realism all the way to abstraction quite nicely. There's not a big jump. I think that it works quite nicely. So this next project actually uses a nice photograph of a symmetrical bouquet of roses with a little bit of baby's breath. It's nicely designed. We move on to the digital structure, the digital rendition. It uses a filter of some kind to kind of accentuate and emphasize certain parts of the roses. This actually uses materials of the rose dried out, placed onto the composition. So the materials and the touch makes you think that it is a rose. Now we move on to a drawing. Tissue paper, magic marker, maybe charcoal. We think they're roses because they're red, maybe, but they are definitely flowers. Now we move on to fantastical color. We're not sure they're roses, but we see they're flowers. They use some kind of leaf structure, but actually the color is starting to question. This one uses really lots of texture, bundled up. We're not sure. It's really starting to get distorted. And then lastly, we move on to the charcoal rendition where your edges get soft. They're kind of just black and white. The color is gone. We might think they're flowers. So as you can see, this is a nice rendition. Again, it goes from realism to abstraction. No big jumps. It talks about uses of material quite nicely, and using touch to represent how you might remember it to be a rose, but then it uses fantastical color to kind of get you into the abstraction. This piece from a student uses more architectural space. Cityscape uses very vertical space, lots of metric rhythm. There's a very strong triangular shape in the negative space in the background, which is the sky. So think about that as we move forward through the abstraction compositions. The next is the digital design. We want to kind of focus on the busyness, the stringiness. It was a technique and a filter, but it kind of mimics the energy in the city that one might have. So he was tapping into the meaning of what it might be in the city if you were inhabiting that space. Then we move on to cut paper. Now he uses similar type of color coding here, and the brown building, the door, the windows kind of reflecting the sky. It is starting to get a little bit more abstract. It is relying on that metric rhythm and mimicking the various shapes that you see in the original photograph. The next one is paint. So now the mark making is getting a little more wiggly. It's using monochromatic color, just white, black, white, and gray. But you can start to get more abstract because of the mark making is a little more organic, and we're not quite sure. Could he have taken some windows away? Probably, to make it a little bit more abstract. We move into cardboard. Cardboard's a kind of an interesting material. Shipping boxes move in and out of the city. Packages move. Again, similar type of composition. Could he have taken away some of that metric rhythm? The windows. He took away the door this time, so that's good. And you want to, again, kind of create some more abstraction. This jumps a little bit. This is interesting. Newspaper, collage, cutting out. Now your white space is moving into the foreground, or is it the background? And you have flat space from the text that's actually creating a shape of the building. So this is a good abstraction from where we need to go. And lastly, you have packaging. You have package shipping labels and packaging boxes, and this is your most abstract. It makes sense to the meaning of the original photograph, and it's really interesting to look at. I think that this is a good place for the ending of the abstract to realism. If you look at the whole set, you will see a similar type of feeling. So from 1 through 5, it relies on those windows. Could there have been less windows? Most likely, but it's a good rendition of realism to abstraction. With a little bit of tweaking, less windows, it would have been stronger. This student's project starts with a nice photograph of some roses in glass. And it's really hard to deal with converting glass to abstraction, but it can go pretty quickly. So I want you to pay attention to how color is used and how materials is used. So we move into cut paper, and it seems like a big jump, but the roses have red, and the use of different reds help to create the intricacies of the petals. And that communicates pretty well the roses. The glass is also divided into vertical shapes and planes, and you know that it's sitting on some kind of a plane. You take away the color, but then you bring back the intricacies of the petals, so you can still see that these are roses even without the color. And the glass is easily communicated through the texture and shapes that the glass kind of reflects. You move on to the next one, which is watercolor. It's getting a little bit more vague. We don't know if this is pansies or peonies or roses, but you do know that they're flowers, and it still uses kind of representational color, but it is getting a little bit more vague and blurry edges. This jumps, it's using melted candy. We are then now focused on shape and blobbiness of shapes, but scale. How much? And the interesting thing about the color is it has a reflectivity kind of like glass when it's melted. So that was really kind of fun. Then this one uses candy wrappers. So it's really starting to get very abstract. We're not quite sure. We know it's something inside a container, but we're not quite sure, and it's sticky and things are coming out. The diagonal lines do help to kind of create the ground quality. So it's really kind of interesting how this becomes abstract. And completely, this one is your digital one. No technology, uses the copy machine. Just black and white. Some kind of rectilinear shapes are thrown in there, which is really interesting. This is the most abstract, no color, and really bizarre shapes. When you look at all 7, you go from the original photograph to this really abstract copy. And everything in between does a good job at moving from realism to abstraction. I would say the only little hiccup is maybe between the original photograph and the first one. But overall, it's a pretty good job. With this next project, it's really a study of materials more than real big abstraction. This is the digital one, and it moves into charcoal. The main dominant shape is the Sydney Opera House. This happens to be felt, but you see this main dominant shape over and over again, and it's really the use of materials that kind of slightly give it an abstraction. The two unconventional, which is pipe cleaners and craft paper, do the best job at kind of maybe communicating what happens in the space. When you see the 7 together, you definitely see the same common element throughout. Is that a downfall? Slightly, but it is creative with the materials. Similar to this student project, it starts with a pretty simple composition. It's a piano keyboard, but how they render it later on, you can see might mimic maybe what might come out of this instrument, the sound. So the first abstraction is just easily done with paint. And the use of the color here is very important because it does not mimic and create a monotone painting. It really kind of talks about the hotness of the color. So it is pushing abstraction a little bit away from the real. Then it uses a digital technique to do similar things, but it's almost a reversed out. So it really is starting to question, like, what is this object I'm looking at? It has some metric rhythm, but the color combination is really quite dynamic. So it is shifting, again, away from the realistic original photograph. This next is charcoal. And I love the wiggliness, and it almost starts, you almost start to hear the music maybe coming out of the instrument, but the wiggliness and the blurriness and the softness is really helping to create the abstraction. The next one is glitter. And again, the color combination is really pretty wild. They're really starting to have fun. And you could even say, you know, again, a layer of meaning might be pianos create celebration and party, and what happens, maybe glitter is thrown, and then it pushes the next material, which is unconventional again, is tinfoil and plastic wrap. I mean, this is really quite interesting to push this a little farther and think about, no, there is, I can't even see a piano there anymore. It's really quite interesting. And then the last one is melted candy, I believe that is. And it's really far, far from the original photograph of being a piano. There is just some nubbiness. There's still some metric rhythm in there making a connection, but overall, it's really quite different. So as you look at the 7 compositions, you can see a really nice progression of realism to abstraction. Even though the composition doesn't change that much, it does have a very similar dominant type of metric rhythm, dominant shapes, but the way that the materials are used to, again, interpret meaning and create a different sensation on the composition is really, really creative. Throw this one in because the original photograph is really abstract to begin with, and they jump to abstraction. So the question becomes, how should you even start with something so abstract? This one I put in here just to show you that you can still use an abstract photograph a little bit and still go even farther. So they went from charcoal to cut paper to this is the digital one, and then they put pine needles with paint, and lastly their unconventional was paint with popcorn. I mean, really kind of nutty, but really fun. So when you look at all 7 of them, you can see how they went from an original photograph to a completely abstraction, and it still does work in a pretty good way. Now this one's a nice version of some really innovative, unconventional, and surprising techniques. So they start with this photograph, and this is the digital version. So they cropped it and colorized it with a different filter. It does have an abstraction. It does look different from the original. Then they moved on to paint, and the way they composition, the bird even is kind of changing a little bit, flying out of the water. The fish is too. They're having fun with the story. This is also some kind of oil pastel or something, and it's getting messy. So even the lines are getting messy and the shapes are getting messy. They use feathers here. That makes a layer of meaning that's really interesting. They're certainly not realistic feathers, but they're really having fun with them, and they're mimicking the large shapes. This is watercolor and sand. It really starts to break down the shapes and the foreground and the background. It becomes very abstract, and this last one is seasoning. And during this time period, mold started to grow on the seasoning. So when you look at all total of the 7, you can see a really nice progression of abstraction that happens continuously and nicely using color, using materials, using shapes, and a creative sense of surprise that even happened with the mold. Last project, you see this great photograph. Foreground, middle ground, background is represented quite well through texture, shape, and color. The first is a painting. Nice, slight abstraction. You definitely can understand that it's still a beach scene. And then you move on to charcoal, which does remove the color, keeps the texture and the shapes, not too much cropping, and you still can understand that it is a beach scene. The next is digital. So copying and changing of color, introducing horizontal bands, that starts to get an abstraction. Then it jumps quite fast to melted crayon or melted wax. It does have some similar types of shaping, and then it moves to yarn. It's doing the same thing. And then the very last one is the most abstract, which is shavings of some kind of crayons, I think. And you kind of have those bands. If you go back to the original, you can see these shapes. So there is a little bit of a jump from the digital to the melted wax, but overall you still have these horizontal bands that actually are very much the same throughout. That helps to tie the whole all the compositions together and makes them similar and work quite well. So now that you've seen and heard me speak, what will you make yourself? Good luck!